Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Miller. Every week, I chat with fascinating people from all walks of life in order to bring you knowledge, inspiration, and insight. If you enjoy the show, you can support it by subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing it with a friend. This is the Jeremy Miller Podcast. Maryke Louw, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to have you here.
Thank you very much.
So I have to start this off by saying I got to give you kudos for all of the content you guys put out on YouTube. It is incredibly detailed. I feel like you guys have hit every single type of running or sports injury or inefficiency that a human can have. So just the detail is incredible. So I got to give you kudos for that.
Thank you very much.
Where did all of this start? I kind of want to get into your background first of what got you into running, what got you into sports physiology, and we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, so I've always loved to be active. So I grew up in the middle of nowhere in South Africa. Basically, the town was so tiny you can call it a big farm, pretty much. And there was just nothing around there. And there wasn't anything to do except be wild. So there wasn't this thing of getting lifts or things. You just ran where you wanted to be, or you cycled where you wanted to be. That was what you did. So then I got to the point where I had to choose what to go do actually with my life. And I can remember saying to somebody, I don't know what to do. And she said, oh, why don't you become a physiotherapist? It has something to do with sport. I thought, oh, okay, I'll go do that. I didn't know what it was. So then I went and studied that, and I wanted to kill that person because for the first 5 years or so, you don't really see sport. You work with a lot of really ill people in hospitals and get them to cough up phlegm and all sorts. And it's like, ugh.
Really?
Yeah. So there's a whole side to physiotherapy that is really nothing to do with sport. But that motivated me to really get into the sport bit. So then around 2010, I moved to the UK from South Africa. And that's when I knew I wanted to be in sports. So I tried to position myself. I did a master's in sports injury management, and I tried to position myself next to people I knew were really, really good with sports injuries to learn from them. And then it so happened that around 2014, our clinic was just getting busier and busier and busier, and I couldn't fit my patients in. So I ended up, they would email in and say, this is happening, what should I do? And I was managing them via email. And I thought, this is nuts. If I can do this via email, surely you need to be able to do it via video call, because then I can actually see you move. Then I set up my first video call clinic at that point, which everybody thought it was nuts, because again, how can you do physiotherapy via video call? Because are you not meant to be touching me to get me better? But it turns out that most injuries just really you need to understand when I need to rest, how much I can do, the things I shouldn't do, and then what I should do to get me better. The bits of the hands-on and things like that, it's all nice to have, but you know what, you can get better without it really. And then, that just started. And then the YouTube channel started because I needed to get a way to educate people and find a way of just explaining. And I found that people, it's the simple things, because healthcare professionals are so busy that they forget that the person sitting in front of you have no clue. They know you, they've got 10 fingers and toes, but that's about it. And I just found if I can explain the basics of how the body functions and how we actually repair ourselves, people go, oh, now I understand why I've got to rest or why I've got to recover. And then it just works so well. That's
amazing. So you were I would imagine, one of the pioneers of the teledoc or telehealth kind of movement. I mean, if you said people were calling you crazy for doing that, I mean, that was only 2014, you said?
Yes. Yeah. So when I looked online, there was one other physio doing it, and she was based out of Australia. So that was the only other person. And literally every single person I told about this just got this look in their eyes. And I thought, oh, here we go. I'm going to have to explain this again.
Do you feel like you've lost, do you feel like you lose any quality doing it online or remotely? Like, have you had any patients where you weren't able to help them because you weren't physically there in person?
Yes. So we've got to be honest about this. There's a very specific type of injury that works online. Luckily, most sports injuries, because they recover really well with a combination of relative rest and strength training. But then there are quite a few other things where if I listen to how you injured yourself, and I suspect it's an ACL tear or serious thing, I'm sending you to the doctor immediately, because there are just cases that no, it's not going to work. Or if you get somebody who's really worried and you can see they're really frightened, it sometimes works better to have a physio in the clinic with them, just for that extra reassurance. But yeah, the funny bit is if you have 45 minutes with a patient and you really have to listen to what they're telling you, it's amazing how much better the treatment gets and the rehab gets, because you then start to understand their goals and everything that's going on in their life, actually.
That's amazing. Yeah, I hope that the telehealth movement continues to grow. It seems like it really is, especially with COVID. For when you say sports, you're talking about sports physiology. Are there specific sports that you specialize in? I know running is a big one, obviously, but are there other ones that you like to touch on as well?
Yeah, so running is my first love, just because I think I know it so well. Because if you do sport yourself, even if it's badly, you understand it much better. Um, but yeah, then my second love, the one I like to support probably as much as running, is rugby, which is a, I don't know, Americans don't play rugby that much. You guys like football more. But yeah, South Africans are absolutely nuts about rugby. Um, but yeah, really, I guess also the bizarre thing for me is I'm happiest if I can help regular people just be active, because I've had so many injuries in the past where I just couldn't go far, and I know how upsetting that is. And to see the joy on somebody's face when they realize, oh, I can go for a walk, that's equivalent to being able to run a marathon if that's what you want to be doing.
Right. That's awesome. Would you say you work with mostly the everyday, like recreational athlete or recreational person, or do you work mostly with elite people?
It very but much changes from time to time. So when I started off, the clinic I worked in Britain, I was quite lucky actually, because we got a really good mix of professional athletes plus just regular athletes, but also really top level endurance athletes. Now, just because of the nature of our YouTube videos and things, a lot of it is about the chronic injuries that people struggle to treat, like a lot of tendinopathies, Achilles tendinopathy, and things like that. We tend to get a really large portion of top endurance athletes in. But then there's also quite a large mix of older athletes, which surprises me these days. Not even athletes, I should just call them older people who like being active, because they literally just want to walk the dog or something. But a really large number of them as well coming in. And it's interesting, the dynamics of having to think about somebody who likes sport versus somebody who really needs to go slowly, because now, because they're 65 or 70 years old, some of them, they've got lots of other things going on as well.
How common are a lot of these same injuries, between somebody who's like in their 60s, just out maybe like walking, doing some jogging, as opposed to an elite marathon runner or something? Do those two groups of people suffer from a lot of the same types of injuries?
Bizarrely enough, yes, but for different reasons. So the elite marathon runner gets they're very prone to overuse injuries. So we're thinking Achilles tendonitis, adductor tendonitis, all of those tendony overuse things, and also some stress fracture type things. And that's literally just because it's really hard to balance your training load plus your nutrition plus your recovery to avoid them. But then the older people, so I remember when I studied physio as a young person, anything to do with hormones and getting older, I just kind of ignored because it never counted enough marks. And then now that I'm 43, I'm suddenly going, there's something like the menopause coming up. What the heck is this about? So now that I've learned more about that, I've realized that anybody over the age of 40, 45, if you're a woman, already your body massively changes. And then because your hormone levels and things drop, that then predisposes you to the same type of tendon injuries that somebody with overuse would get in the earlier life, just because your hormones aren't there. And the funny thing is, people don't realize that men go through a similar thing in their 50s, especially, where hormone levels also change. Because obviously it's not that obvious with you guys that you don't have menstrual cycles and things like that. But what we're seeing is in their 50s, the guys are much more prone to calf strains and Achilles tendonitis type things, even though they don't actually do such a lot of training compared to the guys who train a lot in their younger days.
Outside of hormonal changes as you get older, are there certain injuries that men or women are more prone to, just based on the fact that some are men, some are women?
Yes, so more for the traumatic type things quite often. So there's a lot of research gone into anterior cruciate ligament tears and stuff like that, which often shows women are more prone to it. But to be honest, then they try to dig into why women are more prone to it, and they start thinking that, oh, it's because their legs turn in more. But then for every study that you get for legs turning in more, there's one that shows no, that's not actually the case for this lot. So we're not quite sure yet, but what researchers are now starting to think is that basically just the changes in hormone levels with the menstrual cycle even affects it. So yes, there are certain things, but to be honest, it's genetics also, because what I see often is you will get a person come in and they'll come with some sort of a tendon injury. Then several months later, you'll see them for a different tendon injury and another different tendon injury. And then you go, okay, but wait, what's going on here? And now it's becoming more and more clear that actually there are certain genetic traits that predispose individuals to injuries. And I'm not sure always that it's male versus female, perhaps.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So, going back to the women's cycle. So, basically, what you said was, during different points in the cycle, they could be more
Mm-hmm.
prone to different types of injuries. Are there? I would assume that there's ways you can train around that, or kind of adjust your training schedule to kind of compensate for those changes.
Um, they're definitely starting to get into it, and there are loads of apps and stuff helping women to really try and monitor it. But I will lie if I tell you that I'm on top of that because it's like I can't even remember when my own cycle goes. It's too much trouble. But I definitely see that things that needs to change for the future is that we need to become a lot more aware of how that affects it, and it's different for different women as well. Um, but they also need to start tracking our hormone levels from when we're young, so that when we get to the point where we get to the menopause, what they're doing at the moment is they just go, oh well, try some hormones, and they slap it on and everybody gets the same lot, but we don't know what levels of what. So there's a lot that still needs to go into that research, and I can definitely see for the top athletes at least there will be definite things where they really look at the training cycles. But for the moment, for anybody out there, what I would say is the best advice is go on how you feel in the day. And if you wake up today, you really feel just you have no energy, you feel tired, you don't feel up for it. This is not the day for a hard session. Make it a recovery day because you'll be better off tomorrow then.
That makes perfect sense. And that's something in my own training, and just coaching other athletes that I've really come to
Mm-hmm.
learn lately is just the importance of going based off of feel. And there's definitely there's a fine line between, not pushing hard enough because you don't feel like it, you're not mentally feeling like it, and then not pushing too hard because your body's just not ready for
Yes.
that type of training yet. Which I think that would be a good segue into your experience with some of these elite runners, and then working with the runners. It was in Ethiopia. Was that where it
Oh
was at?
yes, yeah. That was a really interesting experience. Um, because I came from a background in the UK then for several years working with top level athletes and understanding how we do it. And we've got a whole team of people supporting them, and they see the physio at least once, if not twice a week. And then you land in Ethiopia, and there's no physios in Ethiopia except one that was brought in by somebody's
Wow.
agent. I was like, okay, that's interesting. Then you also don't speak the language properly, so you've got a bit of a barrier, and then you've got a big distrust in people because it's funny in Ethiopia, especially, they seem to be worried to give away their edge. So there's a lot of things like that. So yeah, that was a really interesting experience to suddenly be in a situation where people don't actually necessarily trust you. Whereas in the UK, they absolutely trust what the physio says.
How long did you work with them for?
I just went to help somebody out for, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks there, but we also saw the
Okay.
athlete in the UK. We started the whole treatment journey in the UK, and then we just went and followed up in that period.
What was that experience like, just on a day-to-day basis for those couple of weeks? Like, what kind of work were you guys doing with them?
Yes, so, well, there was a lot of strength training rehab, and then dovetailing that in with the running sessions and things as well. But what I found really super interesting was the how they varied their training and their training intensity, not by just running harder. So Addis Ababa is the capital of Ethiopia, is 3,000 meters, I think, above sea level. So that's high. I was just dead the whole
Yeah.
time. They must have thought, what an unfit physio, but I just went up the stairs and then I wanted to die. So what they would do is, if they wanted a hard training session and really push themselves, they would actually go higher above sea level even and train there that day. And if they really wanted an easy, super easy training day, they would drive a couple of hours to a lower point, so they've got more oxygen in
Oh,
the air,
wow.
and then train at that level. And of course, they don't really have rest days at that point because they train several times a day, even sometimes because their bodies have just built up this resilience over years and years and years. Um, and it's interesting because somebody who's new to running, when they read an article about how Mo Farah in the UK, for instance, trained, like 1 day rest in 10 days, then they go, oh, cool, I can run every day. It's like, yeah, but Mo has run for how many years? And
Yep.
that's kind of where the disconnect comes sometimes.
Wow. So they, instead of changing their training paces or the training effort, they would literally just go to different elevations and work
Yeah,
that
so
way.
they would switch it up in so many different ways. So they would change pace as well, but they would play with altitude, they would play with hills, they would all sorts of things that they could do there.
Were these mostly marathon runners or half marathon, or do you know what distances a lot of these guys were
Yeah,
training for?
it was proper. It was somebody who was really trying to get into the marathon, transitioning from track, really good track athlete, and then making that transition into marathon. Um, but yeah, it was interesting to understand for the first time how many of the top runners actually struggle with back injuries, which I,
Back
yes,
injuries.
which I never came across in the general distance running population. Whereas it was quite common for these guys to have sciatica and returning sciatica and issues with that, and just run through it because you know what distance runners are like. You don't feel any
Yep.
any pain really.
What where do you think that back those back injuries come from?
I think it's just a part of pushing yourself, you know, the volume of what they do. Um, yeah, but it's, and then, yeah, if I think back to this person, it's a bit chicken and egg because they had a chronic calf injury at that point, and it could have been that the calf caused the back, but it could also have been that the back, because sometimes if you have a back injury and it affects your nerves, that's one of the key things that then can cause chronic calf issues, and especially those tears that reoccur that doesn't want to stop recurring.
That seems to be, you know, um, another thing that I have to come to learn recently was, you know, if your knee hurts, a lot of times it's not your knee that's actually the source of the injury. It's, you know, might be your IT
Yeah.
band or something in your hip and vice versa. How do you go about diagnosing things like that where it's somebody's, just let's just use the knee for example. Their knee is just killing them, um, but you know, it might not actually be their knee that's hurt.
So the best advice a doctor ever gave me that I worked with, Dr. Webborn, he said, never, ever, ever trust your gut feel because your gut feel in medicine is so often wrong. You can have a good idea because when you tell me how you're injured and what your symptoms are, I can pretty much go 90% of the time that's going to be the issue. But what he always told me was, even if you're pretty sure, test the things above, test the things below, and make doubly sure because the number of times that you'll find something that you didn't expect to find. So yeah, that's the big thing. And it's really quick to screen for it. There are simple movement tests that you can just, for instance, for the sciatic nerve, there's a slump test where you can just bend forwards and get the patient to do certain things, and then you know what you expect to see, and you just check for differences.
That makes sense. One more question on the elite
Mm-hmm.
Ethiopian runners. You mentioned that they're kind of hesitant to give away their
Mm.
edge. Did you, in the 2 to 3 weeks that you were there, did you kind of figure out what makes them so good? What makes them so special?
They just have tenacity. I mean, this person that I helped, he grew up in the middle of nowhere, basically really, really not a lot of money, and they just ran from being little, little, little kids. And then it's that drive because being an elite runner is one of the few ways that you can actually earn a really good living and help your family out of poverty in that country. So there's just a drive that I don't think anybody else can. And you do become like a celebrity. That was the other interesting thing. where yeah, I was definitely hanging out with the celebrity for 3 weeks. The way that people treated
Wow.
him.
That's amazing. So you don't think that it's some, genetic thing or a regional thing, growing up in a specific part of the world, having access to elevation or something, like you think it's a lot of it is just the mindset and the drive that they have?
There's a lot of all of those things. The altitude definitely helps. I mean, gosh, just sleeping in your own bed, you're in an oxygen chamber. Um, but they've not really convincingly been able to prove any of the genetic things. So,
Hmm.
and if you look at athletes doing really really well, and just things like 4 minute mile, everybody thought it wasn't going to happen, and then one person breaks it, and suddenly it's
Right.
within everybody's capabilities. So mental capacity and your way to think about things really plays a big part in performance. So I wouldn't want to go too hard onto anything, but to be honest, I've been a physio now for 20 years, I realized the other day, which is really long. And if that's one thing that have been taught, is that there's never just one thing. Everything has a but to it. So yeah, who knows?
That makes perfect sense because it's I don't know. I feel like it's kind of a cop out for a lot of people to, I do it all the time with myself. I'm like, I'll never be an elite
Yeah.
runner, but I might not ever be an elite runner because I tell myself I'm never going to be an elite
Yeah.
runner. Whereas I might have, the genetic abilities
Can I
or
just say,
or
I
the
just read your
capabilities.
bio before this.
Yeah.
You did not. You only started running it in 2018, and you just did the Boston Marathon in under 3 hours. That is
Yeah, that's
ridiculous.
true. I appreciate it. I played sports growing up, so I was always active. But I don't know. For me, I definitely have that
Yeah,
drive,
yeah.
I think, and I want to continue to get better and push myself. But I don't know. There's definitely some mental limitations that I gotta get rid of, and I think that's where a lot of people get hung up as well. It's just the mental side of things. So if somebody starts to feel an injury creeping in during their training, say, they kind of feel it slowly coming on one day at a time. It's getting worse and worse. What would you recommend that they do at that point?
Yes, so that's a very good question, especially since we're in the marathon season at the moment. Um, I'm actually going to steal an example from my colleague Steph. She did a video about it the other day about Achilles injuries, and she gave the case study of two people. They both consulted her about 4 weeks before the marathon. Now, the one had his training went well, and he was just starting to get a niggle in the Achilles tendon towards the end of the run, and then the next morning it would be a little bit stiff, but then by the following morning it would be okay. The other person is a new runner. So the previous one is also somebody who's a bit more experienced with running. The other one's a new runner, and he's raised lots of money for charity, ignored the Achilles problem, and by the time that he consulted her, that Achilles was super angry. He really struggled to walk in the morning. Everything was painful. Every run was painful. Now, for the guy who had the Achilles that was only painful towards the end of the run and maybe the next morning was a little bit stiff, what that Achilles tendon is starting to say is, I'm struggling to recover. You're pushing me to my edge, and I'm not quite getting that recovery cycle all the way into strengthen. So if you're going to continue running on me like this and pushing me to this point, then that's when it's going to become a proper injury. So what she did with that guy was they didn't stop running totally. They just pulled back a tiny bit to that point where it didn't niggle him and it didn't cause that delayed feeling the next morning, and kept up the rest of the fitness with cross training, cycling, kept the heart rate going. And he was able to complete his marathon in a PB and had no issues afterwards, because the 4 weeks was enough time that, because of the relative rest, just reducing everything to the point where the Achilles could cope, allowed it to recover. But then the other guy, he didn't have enough time. In an ideal situation, he should have stopped running at that point, got to the point where he could slowly rehab it, got better. But he still wanted to do his marathon because he raised lots of money. So he did rest it as much as he could, tried the marathon. He had to give up halfway because the Achilles just said no. So I guess my advice would be, if you have a niggle and it's starting to show up in more than one run, or it's starting to feel stiff, that your first thing in the morning steps tells you a lot about what your body is going through and how well it can recover.
Mm.
And if you 3 days in a row start noticing the same thing, go see a physio. Let them sort it out for you at that point, because often if you can just reduce your load a little bit, let the body get that recovery cycle in, then you can push again.
Yeah, I think that's such a common thing with a lot of runners is like, and I'm guilty of it myself all the time of like, you feel something coming on, but it's not really bad enough to stop you from running. I think those are the worst ones because those are the ones that can
Yeah.
creep in and compound over time. At what point do you think you should call a PT or go see a PT or find somebody like you remotely and start telling them about it as opposed to pulling it back yourself?
Yeah.
Like, should you do it immediately when you start feeling something or give it a little bit of
So
time?
the recipe that works for most things, if you're really just at that point where you're starting to think, do I have a problem, is look at your training, look at where does that problem set in. So is it when I run a 5K, or is it only when I actually push it to 10Ks or maybe even to 20Ks that the issue starts rearing its head? So you want to find that limit where it doesn't irritate it, and you just stick to that for 3 days. If you've brought your load down for 3 days, not complete rest, just to that level, and it hasn't gone, you have to go see a PT. If you feel better at that point, don't just jump back into your training immediately. Ease into it, because it won't have a magic recovery to full strength in 3 days' time. It just brings it to the point where you can then go on. But yeah, I mean, gosh, give it 3 days, 3 to 5 days even of just managing it yourself. But it also depends on the urgency of the situation. If you only have 4 weeks before the race, I would go see the PT more quickly, because then you don't want to waste time. If you have more time to play with, then you could try and fix it yourself first.
That makes perfect sense. I definitely want to talk about strength
Mm-hmm.
training with you and the role that that plays. And I guess we could kind of tie this back to the Ethiopian runners as well, because I think you said that you watch them do a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah.
strength training. How big of a role do you feel like strength training plays into preventing running injuries or sports injuries in general?
Yes. So it's there's no easy answer to that. It's a long-winded answer again, because it depends on your
We got plenty of
it
time.
depends on your training cycle. And again, this is where novice runners often go wrong. They'll go. So if we take a step back even, and we just think of what is the best way to avoid running injuries, then it is about understanding that every time you do a run or every time you do a strength training cycle session, you accumulate some micro damage through the exercise in your body. And that micro damage is in your bones, your ligaments, your tendons, every single part of your body. But now, the hours after your training session, your body then repairs it, and it repairs it stronger than before, so you can do a little bit more as you go on. But the more years that you've been training consistently for, the stronger your tissue is, because it's gone through more of these cycles. But the better your body is also at repairing everything more quickly. And then you've also got genetics into that. And that's why experienced runners who's been consistently running for several years can train many more days in a row without recovery days. And they can, even for their recovery days, can be a run. Whereas if you're a novice runner, you need days of no running. And, you've really got to think about that volume. Now, if we come in with strength training on top of that, strength training has been shown to really give you resilience in your muscles and your tendons and help avoid those overuse injuries. But if you're going to lop strength training on top of your other training and not reduce it or bring it in slowly, you're also just going to overtrain everything. So the worst thing you can do is say, right, I'm starting training for a marathon, so let's ramp up some strength training as well, because I heard I had to do that. But now you've got strength training load plus increased running load, the wheels are going to come off. So you have to build your base in strength training in the season where you're just doing your base miles. And then when you transition to marathon training, at the beginning stages, you reduce your strength training, really quality sessions, and even in the last couple of weeks, I would possibly leave it out, depending on how your legs feel. So I would say strength training is important, but it's always relative to the rest of the stuff you're doing in your program.
Are there specific strength routines or different strength exercises that you would like? If you can only pick a handful of them for runners, which ones would you pick?
Well, I'm a very lazy runner when it comes to strength training, so I can tell you what my favorite is. So if I had to choose my favorite strength training exercise, if we think of, you want to strengthen the glutes, you want to strengthen your quads, your hamstrings, and your calves, and you want to get some mobility through all of that. So I love working up to the point where I can do single leg high bridges. So lying with my heel pressing down on a chair, up and down on one leg, 3 sets of 15. If I can get to where I can do single leg box squats from a chair level. But I usually, when I start with those at the beginning, you've got to start quite high and move your way down. But if you can do 3 sets of 15 single leg like that, then you know your quads are strong and your glutes are really strong. Then for the calves, good old calf raises. I usually try to find something that makes me tired within 10 repetitions. Then I know if I do my 3 sets, that's pretty good with that. Yeah, to be honest, that's my three.
So focusing on glutes, quads, and calves. Those like the top
That's
three
my top
groups
three.
you think people should
Yeah.
focus on. Are there? Oh, what was the question I was just gonna ask? Oh gosh, I had a great question. I totally forgot it. Oh, do you think that weights are necessary? Or, I mean, it sounds like a lot of those things you just mentioned, you can do it just body weight. Do you think you need to incorporate weights for a
It all
runner?
depends on your training status. So for the top athletes, because they're already so fit, if they're not going to incorporate the heavy weights, they're not going to see any gains. For me, at the moment, I'm saying single leg bridges. I would die if I did them at the moment. I'm back on my double leg ones. So for most runners, to be honest, just body weight stuff can be enough. And then adding very low weights to that if you don't find that you get tired within your repetitions. But unless you're a sprinter, you don't really have to go for heavy weights. So I would say always look for something that makes you tired in about 10 to 15 repetitions. And if body weight does that, then you're getting the benefit.
Outside of the injury prevention aspect that strength training provides, do you see any other benefits of strength training as a runner or in
Yes.
sports?
One of the things that I used to be really lazy in my younger days when I was invincible, like your age now, where I didn't have to do warm ups because I was just fine, before you go for a run. Now that I'm getting older, I'm starting to actually notice the difference if I do my strength training moves just a reduced set as a warm up before I go running as well. Everything just feels more connected. So whenever I get into the habit of doing proper strength training once or twice a week, plus a proper warm up before I go running, it just feels as if you've got better control as well. And your times, or at least my 5K times, just seems to improve without me even trying, without having to run more.
Yeah, I think the what I know from strength training is so much of it is based on your nervous system, and I think through that you can develop a lot of the mind to muscle connection, if that's a real thing, I guess, and just becoming more in
Yeah,
tune with your body. And I think there's a lot to be said just about the power
absolutely.
output that you can get from your legs. If you can lift heavy squats or heavy deadlifts, and you're just developing more and more power
Yes,
in those legs and the fast twitch muscle fibers as well.
absolutely. And you're so right with the mind body connection there, because what happens is the more muscle fibers or the heavier the thing is that you lift, the more nerve endings actually have to fire, and the more everything wakes up. And that's actually the first few weeks of strength training. They reckon it's not because we gain muscle mass that we get stronger, it's just because your nerves actually wake up and take note. And yeah, it's honestly, if anybody wants to feel the difference, is do some proper strength training warm up routines and then go for a run versus not, and see what you feel.
So you say for the nervous system benefits of that to do some strength warm ups. What would you say, like with weights? I guess it doesn't matter if you use weights
It
or not.
depends on your fitness level. So when we think of
Okay.
active warm-ups, what the research shows is they're brilliant at improving performance. Unless you overdo them, then you don't have energy left to do your workout. So what I tend to do is, if we think of the exercises I just mentioned that I really like, is I would, if 3 sets of 15 is where I feel I've worked out, then as my warm up, I would do 1 set of 10 single leg bridges. But I'll obviously do some double leg things to work up to it in that session. So I'll do something that pushes me but don't actually get me tired, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Interesting. I'm actually gonna try that out. So as opposed to like, do you also do dynamic stretching, or do you do static stretching before a run, or do you just go in, do a few of those strength
Yeah.
movements, and then go into your
I
run?
guess it depends on the day how I feel. So if I've sat for quite a few hours before I go out for my run, I find my hips get really stiff. So then I will do some static stretches, but I'll follow it with more dynamic moves then afterwards to just wake things up again. So typically I'll do some of the basic, catch your leg backwards, all of those stretches, and then I'll do my free squats, double leg bridges, a few single leg bridges. Um, the calves I don't bother too much with. I'll do a few just movements there. But for myself, and I think it's because I sit so much that if I don't do something to wake my glutes and my hamstrings up, I really feel it in a run. So for me, it's really beneficial to get the stronger glute moves in there, and then I go.
Do you know if there are negative side effects of static stretching before run? I feel like I hear that all the time that you shouldn't static stretch before run. I know a lot of elite runners that they say they don't ever
Yeah.
stretch at all outside of like the dynamic
Mm-hmm.
warm ups. So, what's your take on static stretching?
Yes. So a few years back, about 10 years back, somebody did a study. And it's so funny because researchers always do studies with really good intentions, and then people take the headlines and pull them out of proportion. So they did a study where they showed that if you do a static stretch, it reduces your ability to contract your muscles. Now that sounds awful until you go and look at what they did. So it turns out in that study, they held the stretch for 2 minutes, didn't allow them to move at all, asked them to contract, and guess what? They couldn't really contract that much. Now, I know nobody who holds a stretch for 2 minutes before they go for a run. So then a lot of research confirmed that. And, but then other researchers came and said, yeah, but we don't use that in sport like that. So what happens if we actually stretch like sport? So then what they found was, as long as you hold a static stretch for less than 60 seconds, it doesn't actually switch your muscles off. And if you follow it up with dynamic movements after it, you see no problem with performance afterwards. So essentially, if you want to do static stretches, if you feel you need them and they're beneficial for you, if you stick to the old thing of 3 times 30 seconds and make sure you've got some dynamic moves, it's not going to have a bad influence on your performance. If you just want to do dynamic things, that's fine as well. There are people who does that and it works absolutely fine. And definitely stretching wise, the majority of the research shows that doing regular stretching does not prevent injuries. What I will say is there is some evidence that it doesn't prevent overuse injuries. There is some evidence it can prevent like acute hamstring strains and things like that. And in practice, I will say what I see is that there are definitely some runners who come in and you go, oh my soul, you are as stiff as a stick. You need to mobility work. And that type of person definitely needs it. So when you look at the research, it's also important to understand that they choose their subjects for that study very narrowly. So it doesn't necessarily apply to every single person out there. So it's good to kind of look at the individual rather than go, okay, nobody should do this.
That makes sense. So, in general, stretching is not It's not going to cause any issues, basically.
No.
But it might not do a ton for you.
Yeah.
There's at least static
Yeah,
stretching.
exactly. So I would definitely say dynamic stretching, there's very good evidence that, especially in team sports, if you do a really good warm up that gets everything firing in the way you need it for your sport, that definitely helps prevent injuries. So dynamic stretches, definitely do them. Static stretches, not going to do any harm if you do them, especially before the dynamics, but not needed.
What are some of the more common running injuries that you see, whether it's with elite runners or with the recreational runner?
Yes, so I feel it depends on where I live at the period of time, depending on what I see, because it depends on what type of running the people do. Um, I guess in our clinic, our online clinic, we've got an online clinic that specializes only in Achilles injuries. So we've seen over 3,000 Achilles patients, I think, just in the last 2 years alone, which is a massive number.
Wow.
So that's really common. Other overuse injuries that's really common in runners is adductor tendinopathies, especially in your distance runners. Anything with the kind of the groin pain type thing, osteitis pubis type thing. And then calf strains, super, super common, especially in males over 50. I would say that type of runner are very prone to them. What else? Knee injuries, like your kneecap pain. that I see a lot more in women. Again, you asked me earlier about those two. I would say from my own experience that that is a bit more in women, but definitely also in men.
Would you classify that as runner's knee?
Yeah,
I know that is a broad
it,
term,
it
but
I recently learned it depends on what country you're on in, because I grew up or in the UK and South Africa we think runner's knee is kneecap pain, whereas in parts of Europe I was told that it's ITB syndrome, which to me that's definitely not.
interesting.
So, and then I looked at I thought, right, the research is not going to lie, and then you go, oh, there are researchers calling it this and that, so I don't know.
For some of those more common things, like let's start with the Achilles. What are some common causes of those, and then what are some ways people can prevent or treat Achilles issues?
Yes, so actually this advice is for any overuse running injury. So we'll lump in there any tendon injury, any ITB syndrome even with that. And most, to be honest, most knee injuries as well from running, is that people don't seem to have a good grasp on their training load. So they just, especially the novice runners, they don't look at what they do week on week and how quickly they're increasing things and how much they're pushing the pace. And I laughed at your bio because you wrote the typical, oh yeah, you thought every run you did, you had to push yourself as hard as you could.
Yep.
Did you get injured at that point? Or were you lucky?
um, I had shin splints. I had plantar fasciitis. I had everything you can think of. Everything we just talked about
Okay.
for
Yeah,
for
yeah,
good
yeah.
reason.
That would explain it. So I would say then, think about training load. So keep in mind that your body's got to recover, and that it can only recover and build new strength at a certain pace. So a good rule of thumb is if you look at your training plan, to push for 3 weeks, then take a fourth week as a recovery week. Now that fourth week is not I'm sitting on the couch week. It's just reduce your training load to something that's really easy. So if you're a new runner, even by as much as 50%. If you're a more seasoned runner, 20% can be enough. But what that does is it allows you to catch up with the repair that you didn't have before. So that's one of the big things. And often when I get people to analyze when did their issues start, what were they doing in the 6 to 8 weeks before that, they'll realize that, oh man, they did a 21K race, did really well, really good time, didn't really take a break, was really high on endorphins for that, kept on pushing, and just did too many races in short succession or just too much speed work. And there's a reason why when you look at the top athletes, their year is always like slower, longer runs, then speed sessions, really high intensity for several months, but then coming back from that because you just can't do high intensity all year round.
Wow. So it sounds like really the biggest thing is just developing that understanding of what your body can handle and just easing into it and,
Absolutely.
and not overdoing it.
Absolutely. So, my question to you would be because I'm always interested in coaches, how do you, because I've met coaches who are really rigid with just they kind of experience how they run and how they recover and then they try to put it on the people they coach. How do you mitigate for that in somebody else? How do you decide what is the best plan for them?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges I would say, because it's easy for me to think like, oh, I ran this many miles, I did
Yeah.
this. This person could surely they could do this as well, and so that's I would say again one of the biggest challenges that I've had to kind of
Yeah.
overcome and learn and adapt to. But in general, it's just like I'll give most people generally the same structure of the first 2 to 3 weeks of training, see how they adapt to it or how their body reacts to it. And I guess the for the volume for those first couple of weeks is based off of I'll ask them what their average weekly mileage was for the last three
Yeah.
months and kind of take it from there. Even for that first week will probably be very similar to what they've been averaging for the last 3 months. But because we're probably changing the style of training with maybe the easy runs or a little bit of speed work, we'll just kind of keep it the same volume. And then really for those first 2 to 3 weeks will be very similar volume that they've been doing. But again, just getting them used to that style of training. And then depending on how they go from there, then we'll either increase, decrease, move some things around if needed. But yeah, I would say to put it shortly would be take what they've been doing on average for the last 3 months and kind of implement that so I can just see what their times are, what their easy run paces look like, what their heart rate looks like, and just see how they
Yeah,
feel
yeah.
from everything. Um,
So
yeah, so
yeah,
go ahead.
sorry. So what would be a sign for you that perhaps this person needs a bit more recovery time in their some stuff like that? Because for me, it's always difficult to understand when does somebody need to dial back versus can they push. So yeah, what do you use?
Generally, I would say from an objective data standpoint would be their heart
Okay.
rate, and then next would just be asking them how they feel. But I'm always hesitant to. I always take that with a grain of salt because, like you mentioned earlier, runners want to just keep
Yeah.
going, especially if they're starting out with a new coach or a new training plan. They want to just keep going. They don't want to
Yeah.
pull
Yeah.
back. So I'll take what they say, see how it feels for them, and then from an objective data standpoint would be looking at their heart rate, and then also their speed work paces. Like if I see them starting to dip at the end of workouts, they're probably pushing a little bit too
Gotcha.
hard.
Yeah.
Or if they can't sustain a consistent effort throughout a speed workout, then we'll probably pull it back a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess from my point again, from the physio side, I usually also tell people, when you will be stiff the day after a workout, but if you start finding you're forever massaging and stretching and you're not finding that anything is letting up, then that's usually a sign that actually those muscles are overworked rather than just stiff.
Mm.
So that's one thing that I found through the years can be a good indication that you need a bit more recovery.
Okay, and again, that was just how stiff somebody is in the morning or
Yeah,
throughout the
it's
day.
just that that feeling that you can have sometimes after a workout that you feel, oh, I've had a good workout, I can feel my muscles, but that's actually
Right.
meant to let up at some point. So if it continues like that and you're forever stretching and massaging and it's not really letting go, then that can be a sign that actually this is perhaps a muscle that's overworked rather than just a bit stiff after exercise.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm definitely gonna have to steal that and start asking that to people because that seems like a really good measuring stick. Um, so this is more of a personal question or a selfish question, I guess. So about 2 months ago, I strained or pulled my hip flexor, and I've read a bunch of different mixed things online about when you have a muscle strain or a muscle pull. Some people said you should exercise that muscle to get blood flow and help strengthen it. Other people said because you strained it or pulled it, it's damaged and you need to just let it recover and not exercise it. What is your take on that?
A little bit of both. So if we look at the hip flexors are a little bit tricky. So you've got to be sure what you actually strained there, whether it's the tendon that got irritated or did you actually feel it go as you ran? Or did it become painful?
Kind of,
Okay,
yeah.
yeah, then you
Yeah.
probably strained the muscle. So the first 3 to 5 days after a muscle strain like that is what we call the inflammatory phase. Now, when people hear the inflammatory phase, they want to go have some anti-inflammatories. Don't do that because you need that inflammation to actually get rid of whatever you tore so that the new process can start. So during those 3 to 5 days, you don't want to be doing much. You can keep active and move and do anything that doesn't actually cause pain, but you don't necessarily want to do strength training at that point. So then after the 5 days, everything is now ready to start strengthening. And you've got to remember that most of your muscle is still there and strong. It's just this little portion that's now a little bit weaker. So you have to then figure out how strong is this portion? What can it actually do? Because you want to choose your exercise that it works it at a level where it feels a little bit like a hard work, but not hard work in, oh, I can feel I work out. You take note of what your hips telling you or your muscles telling you. And then as it grows stronger, you want to increase that strength training accordingly. So you've got to gauge. I always tell people, you know what, just go in as light as you can. Because if it's too light, it just means you can go heavier in the next session. But if you jump in with what you think is a light thing, like a squat with kilos on top of it, and then you really overdo it, then you're going to be worse off the next day. So start really light, gentle with the easiest things, test it, and then go from there. And then remember that it needs that recovery cycle. So if you're doing strength training for it, it's only 2 or 3 times a week because you need a day in between where it can actually recover. So if you've got a hip flexor issue, your training plan may actually look something like that. You don't have to rest fully. You could possibly cycle and you could do some running if you can kind of pull with the hamstrings more than push with depending on how your hips are feeling. But yeah, strength training probably 2 to 3 times a week until you get to the point where it can sustain the full strength.
For that 3 to 5 day period right after a strain or a pull, you mentioned the
Mm-hmm.
inflammatory response, and that's obviously your body's natural response to that. Would that therefore mean to not ice an injury like that and just let it kind of do its thing for those three to
Yeah,
five
if I can
days?
tell you how many people have shouted me at me on YouTube because I dare say that you may ice. So, so if we think of the effects of ice versus anti-inflammatories, if you swallow a tablet, it stays in your system for 8 hours, and it has a really widespread specialist effect on your body. So that's quite hectic for inflammatory response suppressant. If we think of ice, you only apply it for 10 minutes at a time. You take it off, maybe reapply for 10 minutes. So it's a very short period. You've got a nice layer of fat between your skin, so there's not a lot of that cold going in. So if it does suppress the inflammatory system, it's very small suppression and it doesn't last very long because your body heats it up quite quickly again. So the main reason why you would want to use ice at that point is immediately after to stop any excess bleeding, because if you can stop the bleeding, it decreases the pressure and then you can actually get better healing. And second, in the days after, you would ice mainly if you feel that it's quite painful and you want to provide a bit of pain relief. But again, ice is one of those things where the only place that I have so far found in the research where the ice is useful is that perhaps it can speed up recovery from ankle sprains. But there's no evidence that icing regularly actually brings a better outcome unless it is about stopping blood, excessive bleeding within the first few hours.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like the ice it's very debated, obviously. As far I'm a big advocate for the ice bath. I have an ice bath here. Do you have a specific protocol you would recommend for ice bathing? Whether it seems like now there's more research on it's better to ice bath before
Okay.
exercising as opposed to after, just because, from my understanding, it blocks hypertrophy if
Yeah,
hypertrophy
yeah,
is
yeah.
your goal. But as far as recovery purposes, do you know if
Well,
there's
first
a
of all,
difference
you've
there?
just gone straight in the bucket of nuts because you've got to be slightly nuts to get into an ice bath. It's so painful. But yeah.
I love that though.
So again, ice baths are one of those things where you've got to think of what is the purpose? Why am I using it? I would be hesitant to use it before a workout, purely because if you cool nerve endings down, they don't send their signal so well. So you may actually end up causing an injury because your proprioception, your position sense isn't that good. So I'd be wary about that. The second thing is, you're definitely right about there's evidence if you ice within, I think it's that half an hour window after doing a strength training session. If you really cool the muscles down at that point, you suppress the inflammatory cycle and then you don't get that hypertrophy. But I'm not sure about what the research says if you're going to do your ice bath 8 hours after you've done your training session, because then I don't think it's going to have a detrimental effect at that point. If you're in a competition day, like for instance, track athletes often have to compete twice in the same day, then you're not looking for strength gains at that point, you're looking for recovery. So at that point, they will come off the track, get into the ice bath, and use it for recovery. And that's brilliant because it gets them out on the track again and performing full speed later on.
Right. That makes
So I
perfect
would use it
sense.
there. But I'm trying to remember now also, ice baths are not meant to be super, super cold. I can't remember do you know what the ideal temperature is off by heart?
I keep mine. I don't know what the
Yeah.
ideal temperature is. I'm sure you know Andrew Huberman. I listened to him talk about
Yeah.
this a lot, and his take on it is from an, I guess, I think his is more of a
Mm-hmm.
neuroscience perspective, that it just needs to be
Yeah.
uncomfortable, which is subjective. So I don't know the exact
Yeah, but that sounds
temperature
about right.
for
That
recovery
sounds about right
purposes.
because I, again, young physio, I used to think ice baths, the colder the better, but it turns out no,
Right.
it's actually not like that at all. So uncomfortable but not painful sounds like a very good measure of what it should be.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, my ego gets in the way sometimes when I want to crank it all the way
Yeah.
down. Are there some other recovery tips or tricks that you'd recommend for people to help speed up that recovery? Just because it seems like that recovery is just as important as the training on your body.
Absolutely. So I remember when I was still doing a lot of hands-on physio, so I would sometimes do 12 hours on my feet, and trying to train for a marathon at the same time as doing 12 hours on your feet is just ridiculous. I couldn't do a lot of running in those weeks because your legs are just knackered. So it's about thinking about everything you do in your day. Because even though you don't think walking or standing is much, that actually tires your legs and stops them from recovering fully. But then nutrition, and I again giggle when I look at your Instagram account because you are always eating, which is brilliant.
Yeah.
Because so many of the endurance athletes really kind of go, the lighter I can get, the better it's going to be. But we definitely now know that a lot of these overuse injuries, especially stress fractures, can be avoided if you replace the energy that you burn, because you burn so much that you really need that. So nutrition is a big one, and sleep. Sleep is also a really, really big one. Getting enough hours of sleep in your day is really important.
Yeah, I feel like I hear people talk about sleep as kind of the pillar, the main pillar of any recovery method. Um, so nutrition, sleep, and then is there anything else? Like I know for me, it seems like active recovery is a really big part of it. Just what makes me feel
Yeah.
better. Like when I just ran Boston last week, I think we walked, I don't know how many miles
Yeah.
later on that day. We walked for like 5-6 hours, which I didn't want to go walk because
Yeah.
it doesn't. I just want to go lay
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
bed, but I felt
Yeah.
fantastic
Yeah.
the following day, and I was able to move
Well,
around
you
and
also
just
have to
fine.
think
So
that you were
when
ill last week. I wonder why.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, we're in museums
Yeah. Yeah.
and Uber rides and all kinds of stuff, so I think that might have had a part of it, but definitely just like beat
Yeah.
down physically too.
So to put this in perspective, you finished that marathon in 2 hours 52, was it? Yes.
Yep.
So I run a marathon. It's going to be 5 hours 30. So now start thinking about how many hours I'm on my feet compared to what you're on your feet in that
Right.
marathon. So that's already a big difference. Secondly, you're obviously super, super fit compared to what I am at the moment. So you are going to be able to recover and active recover quite quickly. So I think, again, it's for every person um, where they are in their training journey will be different. And it's important to understand that bit. And that's why it's so important to tune in to how you feel. Am I feeling
Hmm.
like for me, I know when I'm overworked, even when I'm not. It's when you tell me the sky is blue and I want to cry. Then I usually know, I think I should go sleep now. So it's about those mood changes and realizing, okay, if I'm starting to think things like this, my body is perhaps telling me I'm not as recovered as I should be, and I should be taking more care of that part.
That makes sense. Do you ever prescribe any kind of active recovery? So like after a long run, I know a lot of people will hop on a bike and do like a 30-45 minute kind of spin out, or people will just go for a
Yeah.
walk. Do you ever prescribe anything like that?
It depends on what people have available. If they can get in a swimming pool, then swimming is for me one
Hmm.
of my favorites. It can just make things feel so much better, and especially for older runners. What I often find is if they can either bring cycling into their routine as a regular basis or swimming, their running improves and they just feel better with it as well. And I haven't got any hard evidence to prove this, but just again from my own experience is I think it's to do with the fact that you get a lot of joint movement, but you don't have a lot of impact. So what happens is our joints don't actually have arteries going into them. They rely on movement to push fluid and nutrients and things in and out. Now, if you finish your run, and the same with muscles to an extent, if you're just sitting still, the blood supply is going to decrease, so you're not getting rid of things as easily, getting new things in. So if you're just sitting still after a long run, your joints are just kind of going, yeah, we also want some feeding. We also want some feeding. Just move me, please. It's not happening. Whereas if you go and cycle or you go and swim, you're feeding them, but you're not actually putting more work on them.
Okay, so it's more just about the getting blood flow into those areas, just in some sort of low impact way.
Absolutely, yeah. So it allows the body to recover basically then.
Did you see, when you've worked with all these elite runners, elite athletes, do they follow any kind of specific recovery protocol? I'm sure it's very subjective, but is there kind of a common thing that a lot of them tend to do?
Yep. So a lot of them will get on the bike, but then you've just got so many equal number who hates a bike. If you mention a bike, they just run the other way. So they will often do slow runs, or they will just do, a lot of them like mobility workouts, but they will just do a stretching foam rolling session, is a big one.
Awesome. So I kind of want to talk about your business now and what you're doing. So it's sports injury physio, right?
Yes. Yeah. So we've got two clinics. We've got the sportsinjuryphysio.com and then treatmyachilles.com, which is also a specialist one more.
And what kind of work do you guys do? Is it all remote telehealth type
Yep,
stuff?
we're 100% remote. So it's funny, we always get emails, or often get emails of people saying, "Oh, I'm in London, so it will have to be remote." It's like, yeah, even if you were in Brighton, it would be remote. But what we've done is we've built a team of absolute specialist physios. So they all have master's degrees in sports injury management. They're all old like me, so they've got lots of experience. And they,
You keep saying you're old. I don't think you're that old.
I turned 30, 43. It's like, oh,
That's not
yeah,
old.
but it's like when, trust me, I went for a run this morning. That's when you feel you're old. So yeah, it's just people who have worked with really really top athletes in their time, but also just have a passion for regular people. So we see a whole spectrum of people who want to be active rather than just sporty people. But it's a joy because every single person who comes to us, they want rehab, so they're looking for exercise, they're looking for a way to be active. You don't have to try to get people to take up sport or activity. You rather have to rein them in a little bit. So it's just a brilliant patient load we're getting in.
And do you have to be based in the UK to work with you guys, or because it's remote, I'm assuming you guys work with people all over the world, right?
Yeah, so our physios are all based in the UK because we're a UK-based physio practice, but actually, yeah, we see patients from all over the world. So we've got lots of people from the USA, but even bizarre countries. Every now and then something pops up that you go, "Oh, I didn't know they had internet there." So,
That's awesome. That's amazing. Does somebody have to have an injury to work with you guys, or can you guys work with somebody who maybe just wants some like preventative exercises to do for maybe like a past injury that they had and they want to make sure that doesn't occur again?
absolutely, yes. So we do have, if that's, so we pretty much, everybody deals with all sports injuries. But then if you're looking for proper injury prevention for a certain sport, there are definite team members who are better at different things. And we cover quite a large base. We even cover dancers. So there's quite a wide spectrum of what they do.
That's awesome. And then you work with Exakt Health a little bit as well, right?
Yes. So interesting story there. In the pandemic, so I started 2019, before the pandemic started. We made the move to remote only because we wanted to travel and see the rest of the world. And I still remember flying to Thailand and hearing on the airport, "If you've been to Wuhan province, go to see your doctor." And we just thought, ignore that. And of course, 3 months later, we were all in lockdown. But during that period, a runner from Germany contacted me, and he had an overuse injury that he saw 3 doctors in Germany and they couldn't diagnose and help him. And turned out that it was something that I'd already seen quite a lot of, and I sorted him out. And that was Philip, who is now the CEO of Exakt Health. And that inspired him to go, "How can this be done better online than it can be done in person? I'm sure we can build an app for that," because he was in the tech industry at that point. And yeah, so he partnered up with a colleague that he was working with who's a brilliant engineer. And the 3 of us started Exakt Health and the app we created.
That's amazing. And for people who don't know what Exakt Health is, you want to just give like a rundown of what you
Yes,
guys do?
so the vision for us is, it's basically, I don't know how it is in the USA, but in Europe definitely, and the UK and most other places I chat to people, if you want to see a doctor, there's a massive long wait list. Also, it's super expensive, so most people can't actually access the help they need to get. And then to find a physio who knows what they're doing with sports injuries is just as difficult. So our aim with Exakt Health is to actually allow people to treat their own sports injuries safely via a mobile app. Now, if you think people thought I was nuts for doing online physio, then can you imagine people's faces when you tell them an app's going to treat them? So the the way this app works is when you walk into my office or you consult me online, there's an algorithm I apply in my head. I ask you questions, and there are specific strength tests I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to ask you about your pain and all of those things that's related to it to decide, just like you decide how to create a plan for somebody who wants to run. That's how I decide where we start with your injury. Now, with the app, we assume that, well, you first got to have a diagnosis. So you come in and you know you've got runner's knee, you choose the runner's knee program. So we assume everybody who starts the app has the worst case scenario. So the first exercise you start with is absolutely the easiest things to test. So the person who is really bad will start there and not progress for a while, whereas the person who's good will progress quite quickly until they find their upper limit to where they can train from. And then they can follow their rehab there. And then we basically ask for feedback about your pain and how difficult you find the exercises, and we use that to then adapt the rehab plan until you can get back to running.
I've used the app quite a bit actually, and I really love it. Fortunately, I haven't really had to use it for
Mm-hmm.
rehabbing an injury, but more so if I use it all the time for the injury
Oh,
prevention
brilliant.
aspect of it, and I take so many of those. I follow like a lot of the protocols in there and take those and do those almost every day now, and it works so well because I know where I have certain deficiencies now, and I just love the layout of the app, how easy it is to use. So you guys are doing a phenomenal
Thank you.
job with it.
I'm really excited because we're busy redesigning the workout flow at the moment. So hopefully, in about 4 or 6 weeks' time, you're going to open it and go, woo, this is now even smoother.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Is there like a kind of a grand vision for where you want to take sports injury physio, or where you want to take Exakt? Like, is there a kind of a long term goal for all that?
So the big plan, if I may dream big, is that we eventually fine tune the pain feedback and the load management part in the app so much that we can connect AI to that, that you really get it to start taking over that process and helping people understand when can I push my rehab? Oh, no, 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 I've overdone it a bit. So I've just got to pull back. Now I can go back in. So to really allow people to manage it fully like that, but then also to allow them, if they need to chat to somebody, just, have somebody, a video consultation with somebody and put that together, that you can, because sometimes you just need that reassurance to check, am I actually on the right route here?
Right.
And eventually, just like with, I feel, if we look at the internet for a moment, you can literally study nearly any course these days online, and we've really brought education and things to everybody. But the big thing that's not there for everybody is healthcare. And it's ridiculous that people have to pay so much money for healthcare and to have healthy lives. And if they can just be active, they won't need half of the healthcare. So if we can get to the point where we can actually make healthcare affordable and make it good, that people can access it 24 hours a day, that would be absolutely amazing.
I love it. That's a great goal, and I feel like with the AI side of things, I mean, now with things like Chat GPT and Snapchat just came out with their like
Mm.
AI chat bot that's like scary good. I feel like that implementation probably isn't that far off to implement that into something like Exact.
Absolutely. I mean, at the moment, I'd be a little bit worried if it starts hallucinating,
Yeah.
telling people to do weird things. But if you look at the speed of development, it's literally every 4 weeks there's a total new thing that's come out. So I think a year from now we may be having this conversation saying, "Oh, we've just integrated our AI."
Right. That's amazing. Yeah. Well, I'm excited to see where all that goes for you guys. I mean, it's amazing right now, and I know it's only going to continue to get better. Is there a great place, or is there a good place for people to find you and connect with you?
Yes, so I guess the best is if they had any questions for me myself, they can always email me. I'm either at info@sportsinjuryphysio.com or I'm at maryke.low@exakthealth.com. But they're also welcome to just check out the YouTube channel if they've got questions about injuries or anything like that. And yeah, just feel free to contact me in any way you like. I'm better with
That's awesome.
answering emails than I am YouTube comments. So yes.
I mean, with how much content you guys put out, I'm sure there's tons and tons of comments you got to respond
Yeah,
to.
there's quite a lot. It takes about 3 hours every
Well,
five
that's what
days.
happens. I mean, that's the price you pay when you put out high quality content is people, they consume it and they enjoy it. So, but I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us. I feel like I have so many things I can go and implement into my own training and for people that I coach. And I'm sure people got a ton out of this as well. So thank you so much.
It's a big pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a review, and share it with a friend. We'll see you in the next one.